Hello, my dear ladies. I'm so grateful you're here. Usually we share women's stories, stories of love, betrayal, and quiet strength. But today is a little different. A kind man named Michael reached out to us with a story straight from the heart. He asked if we could share it with you. And once we read it, we knew we had to. Because it's not just about money. It's about trust, legacy, and the truth that came after everything else fell apart. Now, I'll speak in Michael's voice. He writes, "You think you know a person, sleep next to them for 30 years, raise kids together, share meals, holidays, late-night worries, and little inside jokes that nobody else in the world would understand, and then one moment tears it all apart like it was never real. For me, that moment came on the day we buried my father. A quiet man who built everything we had from the ground up with his bare hands and a stubborn sense of pride. But the real shock didn't come when we lowered him into the ground. That came later, when my wife smiled through tears and walked away with $247 million. And then something happened, something that made her freeze like she'd seen a ghost. My name is Michael. I'm 61 years old, and this is the story of how everything I thought I knew crumbled in a single afternoon, only to reveal a truth far deeper, colder, and more calculated than I ever could have imagined. The morning of the funeral was gray, not just in the sky, but in the way people moved and spoke, like the whole world had taken a breath and was holding it in. My father's casket sat at the front of the church, surrounded by white lilies and a framed photo of him from better days, when his eyes still sparkled with mischief and wisdom. My wife, Joan, stood next to me, with her arm looped gently through mine, her voice low as she murmured little comforting words that felt more practiced than heartfelt. Her black dress clung to her like it was made for the stage, and she wore the kind of heels you don't choose unless you want to be seen. I wanted to believe her grief was real. I needed to. But something about the way her fingers tapped rhythmically on the folded funeral program, something about the way she looked past the casket instead of at it, it scratched at the back of my mind like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. My father wasn't a man of extravagance, but he built a quiet empire. Warehouses, shipping contracts, some real estate in Florida, and more than a few investments that paid off big when the market surged. We never talked about how much he was worth, but I knew it had to be in the hundreds of millions. Still, he always told me money was like water. It'll either keep you alive or drown you, depending on how you carry it. After the service, we followed the hearse to the cemetery. I remember watching the casket lower slowly into the earth, a strange stillness settling over everything. Joan held a tissue to her eye, but her cheeks were dry. She leaned close and whispered something about how proud he would have been of the ceremony, how beautiful the flowers were. But my ears were ringing too loud to really hear. I just nodded, heart hollow. That evening, the lawyer invited us to a small private room in his office downtown. It was supposed to be a simple reading of the will, just formality. My father's longtime attorney, Robert Langston, sat behind his polished oak desk, his expression unreadable as he opened the envelope and began to speak in that calm, neutral voice lawyers always seem to use when they're about to ruin someone's life or make them rich beyond imagining. He cleared his throat and read it aloud. My father left everything, every property, every account, every share of stock to Joan. I blinked. My stomach turned cold. Joan gasped softly, then covered her mouth in what looked like shock, but I knew that sound. I had lived long enough beside her to know when she was genuinely surprised and when she was pretending. And this wasn't surprise. This was performance. She turned to me, eyes wide, trembling hands reaching for mine, saying it must be some mistake, that this wasn't what she wanted. But her grip was tight, and there was a flicker, just a flicker, in her eyes that told me she'd been waiting for this moment, planning for it. Robert went on about how the will had been revised 6 months ago, signed, notarized, witnessed, everything in order. My name wasn't mentioned even once. Joan received it all. Before I could speak, she stood, thanked the lawyer, and kissed my cheek like we were just leaving a dinner party. She whispered that she needed some air and stepped outside. She never came home. That night, Joan disappeared. No note, no call, just vanished. And yet, that wasn't the end, not even close. Because 40 days later, Robert invited me back to his office, alone this time. And when I walked in, he was holding a second envelope in his hand. An envelope my father had left behind with very specific instructions. Looking back now, I realize how easy it is to ignore the signs when you don't want to see them, especially when they come wrapped in love and wrapped around your daily routines. I wasn't blind, not really, I was just hopeful. Hopeful that the woman I married had a heart as deep as her smile, that the life we built together was real, and that when she looked at me, she saw a man she loved, not just a stepping stone to a bigger fortune. But life has a way of peeling back the layers, slowly at first, until what's left underneath is raw and impossible to ignore. My father's name was Thomas. To most people, he was Mr. Grant, a sharp, stoic businessman who knew how to read people better than a poker dealer in Vegas. But to me, he was just Dad. He taught me how to fix a car before I was old enough to drive one, how to shake hands without looking nervous, and how to walk into a room like I belonged there, even if I wasn't sure that I did. He built his first warehouse in his 20s with a loan he never told anyone how he got. And from there, it was one slow, stubborn climb up a ladder no one thought he'd survive. But he did. He made it. He bought land, invested in freight companies, quietly scooped up rental properties, and never once flashed it around like some people do. You'd never guess he was worth hundreds of millions unless you looked at his shoes. He believed you could always judge a man by his shoes. Growing up, I saw him every day at the breakfast table reading the paper with one hand and underlining things in the business section with the other. He never talked much about money, but he never let me forget that loyalty was worth more than any paycheck. My mother passed when I was 17, and after that, it was just the two of us for a long while. He never remarried, said once was enough for a lifetime. I met Joan 10 years later, in the middle of one of those quiet months where nothing exciting was happening, and I wasn't really looking for anything. She came into my life like a gust of warm wind, beautiful, confident, full of charm that felt effortless. She laughed at my awkward jokes, asked smart questions about my work, and looked at me like I was the only man in the room. I fell hard, and I fell fast. My father liked her, or at least pretended to. He was polite, asked about her family, her plans, her past. She had answers for everything, neat and tidy, the kind of answers you'd expect from someone who rehearsed them. I didn't see it then. I didn't want to. Joan was never loud with her ambition, but it was there, humming beneath the surface like a motor running quietly under a polished hood. She always wanted to know more about the family business, what properties we owned, what deals were in progress, how the trusts were structured. I chalked it up to curiosity, a wife who wanted to be involved. But now, in hindsight, I see the way her questions always circled around numbers, around names, around power. The first time I noticed something off, it was small. I had left my laptop open while I was on the phone, and when I came back, Joan quickly minimized something. She smiled and made a joke, but her hand shook just enough for me to notice. Later that week, one of my passwords didn't work. I told myself I had just typed it wrong. Over time, there were more of those little moments. A receipt for a hotel in her purse. She said she'd met a friend for lunch. Jewelry I didn't recognize. She claimed it was a gift from a client. A text on her phone that she read a little too quickly and deleted a little too fast. I confronted her once gently, half hoping she'd laugh it off and tell me I was being ridiculous. Instead, she got angry, accused me of not trusting her, cried in a way that made me feel ashamed for doubting her. I apologized. I shouldn't have. My father, though, he never said much, but I could tell he was watching her. He was always polite, but distant. Once, after a family dinner, as Joan went out to warm up the car, he looked at me and asked, "You trust her?" I laughed, brushed it off, told him not to be so old-fashioned. He didn't push. He just nodded slowly and went back to his drink. It was about 6 months before his death when things really started to change. He called me one day out of the blue, asked me to meet him at the office, said it wasn't urgent, just something he wanted to talk about. I showed up thinking he'd bring up retirement or hand off more of the business, but instead he slid a folder across the desk, thin and marked with my name in his neat handwriting. He told me to keep it safe, said I might need it one day, and to trust him that when the time came, I'd understand. I opened it that night when I got home. It was filled with documents I didn't understand, legal papers, a sealed letter, copies of property deeds, and a note that simply read, "If you're reading this after I'm gone, don't trust the surface of things. Look deeper. And remember, loyalty doesn't wear diamonds." I folded the letter and put everything back, unsure whether I should feel touched or worried. I told Joan about it the next morning over coffee, watching her face carefully as I mentioned the folder. She smiled, asked if he was finally ready to step back, but her eyes didn't smile with her mouth. That was the first time I realized something in me had shifted, a seed of doubt, one I couldn't quite shake. And as it turned out, that seed was about to grow into something I never could have imagined. For days after the funeral, I moved through the world like I was floating in someone else's life, doing the right things and saying the expected words. But inside, I was unraveling in silence, caught between grief for my father and a quiet, burning confusion about the woman I had shared my life with for over 3 decades. I didn't want to believe what I already knew. Joan hadn't just left me with her absence. She had taken something far heavier with her, the truth. And now I was left alone in a house that felt hollow, echoing with memories and questions I wasn't ready to answer. I tried to reach her, called her phone, sent emails, even contacted her sister, who hadn't heard a word either. Days turned to weeks, and it became clear that Joan wasn't coming back. She hadn't just taken the inheritance. She had vanished, like a stage actress exiting her final scene, leaving behind the set and the audience still blinking in disbelief. Our joint accounts were cleaned out. Her closet was empty. Even her favorite tea mug was gone from the kitchen shelf, as if she had carefully chosen every last piece of her presents to erase. Friends tried to comfort me, some with awkward jokes, some with cautious questions, but no one said what they were really thinking. That Joan had played me, that she had been planning this for a long, long time. I could feel it in the way they looked at me, the way they hesitated before saying her name. My pride kept me from admitting it out loud, but deep down, a storm was building, one I couldn't ignore any longer. Then one evening, just as the sun was slipping behind the trees, painting the living room in golden shadows, I got a call from Robert, my father's lawyer. He asked if I could come to the office the next day, alone. There was something important, something my father had left behind. The tone in his voice wasn't casual. It carried weight, the kind that makes your stomach tighten before your mind even understands why. When I arrived, Robert was already waiting in the conference room, a large manila envelope resting in front of him on the polished table. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept well in days, and I wondered briefly how long he'd been holding on to whatever it was he was about to show me. He slid the envelope toward me and said softly, "Your father instructed me to give this to you exactly 40 days after his passing. He was very specific about the timing. He said it would all make sense by then." With a trembling hand, I opened it. Inside was a sealed letter in my father's handwriting, along with a copy of a different will, not the one that had been read at the funeral. This one had a new date, just 3 weeks after the first. I stared at the paper, trying to make sense of it, my heart pounding louder than Robert's voice as he explained what it meant. In this second will, everything, every dollar, every property, every asset was to be returned to me. Joan was to receive nothing, not a cent, and at the bottom, in the sharp, unmistakable signature I had seen 1,000 times, was my father's name. Robert looked at me carefully and said, "He made this after a private conversation with me, after something came to his attention. He told me he had his suspicions for a while, but what he discovered in those final weeks, he couldn't ignore it. I couldn't breathe. My mouth went dry. I asked what exactly my father had found, but Robert only nodded toward the envelope again and said, "It's in the letter." I opened it slowly. My father's words were direct, but full of quiet sorrow. He spoke of loyalty, of betrayal, of how he had noticed Joan's behavior change over time, how she asked too many questions, showed up at the office when I wasn't there, called vendors pretending to be my assistant. He had hired someone to look into it discreetly. What they uncovered made him realize Joan had been planning this for over a year, manipulating me, isolating me, positioning herself to inherit everything. He couldn't prove it all, not in a courtroom, but in his heart. He knew what she was after, and so he wrote the second will. He kept it secret, instructed Robert to hold it in trust and deliver it only after enough time had passed for the first wave of shock to settle, so that I would be clear-headed enough to understand not just what Joan had done, but why he had waited. Sometimes, he wrote, the lesson must come with silence, so it can echo long enough to be heard. I sat in that room for what felt like hours, letter in hand, the weight of it pressing against everything I thought I knew. My father hadn't just seen the truth, he had protected me from it until I was ready to carry it. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because Joan, she came back. Not with an apology, not with regret, but with a lawyer of her own, and a plan to fight the second will. The morning Joan returned was as ordinary as any other. Cool breeze drifting in through the kitchen window, the sound of birds tapping along the glass like they had some secret to share, and the coffee brewing in the corner, sending its familiar scent into the room where I sat, still unsure whether I was awake or just stuck in some long, drawn-out dream that refused to end. Then the doorbell rang. A quiet chime, one I'd heard 1,000 times before, but this time it came with a chill so sharp it slid right through my spine and settled into my bones. I opened the door and there she was, Joan standing in a tailored beige coat, sunglasses perched in her hair, the kind of calm expression on her face that made my chest tighten, because it wasn't guilt I saw, not sorrow or shame, but calculation. She smiled gently, like she'd only stepped out for a few errands and was surprised I hadn't made her tea yet. Behind her stood a younger man in a slick gray suit with a leather briefcase and a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. She didn't ask to come in. She stepped over the threshold like she still belonged there and sat down on the same couch where we used to read the Sunday paper together, where I had once held her hand and believed it meant something. Her lawyer introduced himself, Brent something, I don't remember the rest, and explained they had come to discuss some inconsistencies regarding the estate documents. That was his phrase, inconsistencies. I felt the burn rise in my throat, but I said nothing. I didn't ask her why she left without a word. I didn't ask where the money went. I didn't ask if any of it had ever been real, because by then I already knew the answer. All I did was reach for the file I had tucked inside the bookshelf weeks ago, the one with the second will and my father's letter, and I placed it quietly on the table between us. Brent opened it, glanced through the pages with practiced indifference, but I saw the moment his fingers paused, the moment he read the date and realized what it meant. Joan said nothing at first. She just stared at me with those perfect eyes, blinking slowly like she was calculating the cost of this new development. Then she smiled, sharp, cold, and so unfamiliar it made my skin crawl, and said that this was just a delay, that the first will had already gone through probate, and any afterthoughts wouldn't hold up in court. That word, afterthought, made something snap inside me. I stood up too fast, chair scraping against the floor, heart pounding so hard I thought it might break my ribs. I told her this wasn't just about money. This was about my father, about the betrayal, about the years I had spent loving a woman who now sat across from me like a stranger in my own house. And for a moment, just a split second, I felt dizzy, like the weight of it all had finally crushed the last bit of breath from my lungs. My knees buckled slightly, the room spun, and I had to grip the back of the chair to steady myself. Joan's face changed. For the briefest flicker of a second, the mask dropped. She moved forward like she was about to reach for me, like she might say something human, something soft. But then Brent stood up, placed a hand on her shoulder, and just like that, she pulled back. She adjusted her coat, stood tall, and announced that they would be in touch. No apology, no hesitation, just strategy. They left, and the silence that followed felt different this time. Not empty, but full of something waiting, something shifting in the air like a storm gathering just beyond the window. I sat there for what felt like hours, heart still thudding in my ears, replaying every word, every glance, every breath. That night, Robert called again. He'd heard from Brent. A formal court challenge was coming. Joan was going to fight the second will, claim undue influence, mental decline, whatever angle they could twist to make it seem like the first will should stand. And that's when Robert told me something I didn't expect, something that made my heart race for an entirely different reason. He said there was another document, one that had only come into his possession recently, passed along by my father's private accountant, who had held onto it under specific instructions. It wasn't just a letter or an extra signature, it was a recording. My father had left behind a video, but before it could be used in court, we needed to confirm its authenticity, and if it was real, if it was what Robert believed it to be, it could end everything. But if it wasn't, if the court rejected it, I could lose not just the inheritance, but everything else that came with it. And so we waited. For tests, for paperwork, for permission to present it. For that moment when the truth, raw, unfiltered, undeniable, would finally speak for itself. But I knew one thing for sure. Joan had made her move. And now it was my turn. Sowart rooms have their own kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, strained kind that clings to the walls and makes your chest tighten the moment you walk in. And as I sat at the polished wooden table beside Robert, staring straight ahead at the judge's bench, I could feel that silence settle around me like a second skin, cold and unshakable. While on the other side of the room, Joan sat with her lawyer, calm as ever. Legs crossed just so, hands folded neatly in her lap, not a trace of nerves on her face. Like this was just another meeting in a long week of business negotiations, rather than the fight over the very soul of the legacy my father had built with a lifetime of sweat and sacrifice. The courtroom was filled with a few reporters, some distant cousins, and people who once shook my father's hand and now came only to witness what they thought might become a public unraveling of something private. But I had already decided I wouldn't give them that satisfaction, not today. Joan's attorney began with confidence, speaking of timelines and mental state, painting the image of an aging man influenced by grief, by pressure, by suggestion, suggesting, without using the word, that perhaps I had pushed my father to write the second will, that perhaps my presence in those final weeks had been strategic, manipulative, even desperate. And while I sat motionless, jaw tight and hands clenched under the table, I could feel the audience begin to shift, sensing the story they thought they came to hear. The bitter son, the jealous husband trying to claw back a fortune he never earned. But then Robert stood and laid out our case, calm, deliberate, laying down facts like bricks, dates, documents, notarized signatures, timestamps, even logs from my father's visits to the notary, receipts from his meetings with the private investigator he had hired, and slowly, piece by piece, that carefully painted image from Joan's side began to crack. Still, none of it could fully erase the shadow of doubt unless we had something stronger, something undeniable. And that's when the moment came. The judge granted permission for the video to be submitted, and even as the technician set up the screen in front of the courtroom, I could barely breathe. because no matter how confident I was in my father's intentions, no matter how many times Robert had reassured me that the video had been verified, there was still that fear, that ache in my chest, that maybe it wouldn't be enough, that maybe Joan would still win, that maybe the truth wasn't strong enough to fight against charm and strategy and the years she had spent crafting her narrative. And then the screen lit up. My father's face filled the room, not frail, not confused, but sharp-eyed and steady, sitting in the leather chair in his study, the same room where I had once done my homework and later signed business contracts under his watchful gaze. And in that quiet room, his voice filled the courtroom with a kind of clarity that didn't need emotion to cut deep. He spoke of choices, of regrets, of watching the people closest to him and seeing what they chose to do when no one was watching, of the way loyalty reveals itself not in the big moments but in the quiet ones, like who shows up when there's no money to be made, who asks questions when they think no one's listening, who walks away when you stop giving. And then he said it, plain, direct, final, that he had come to believe Joan was not the person she pretended to be, that he had once trusted her with the family, with me, with the future, and that trust had been broken in ways he could no longer excuse or ignore, and because of that, he had changed the will. There were no accusations, no venom, just a quiet, unwavering truth delivered by a man who had nothing left to gain but peace. And when the screen went dark, the silence in the room was different this time, thick with something heavier than doubt, something close to realization. Joan didn't look up. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She just adjusted her jacket and stared straight ahead, as if she'd expected this, or maybe prepared herself not to care. But I saw it. The smallest twitch in her jaw, the tiniest falter in her breath, and I knew that underneath the perfect exterior, the cracks had begun to form. Over the next 2 days, more evidence was submitted. Emails, financial transfers, notes from the investigator's report detailing strange bank activity under Joan's name that began months before my father's diagnosis. Conversations she'd had with vendors under false names, and even a lease for an apartment purchased in cash in a different state just weeks before the funeral. One by one, the pieces came together, and with every hour that passed, her story unraveled not in a dramatic explosion, but in the slow, inevitable collapse of a tower built on shaky ground. And still, she sat there, untouched by panic, as if denying it all through stillness alone might make it go away. When the judge recessed before the verdict, Robert turned to me and nodded once, quiet but sure. We had done everything we could. Now it was up to the court. And though my body felt like it had run a marathon without moving, heart heavy, eyes aching and breath shallow, I felt something else too. Relief. Not because I knew I would win, but because no matter the outcome, the truth had been spoken, and not just by me. It had come from the man who built everything, who watched more carefully than I ever realized, and who made sure that even in death, he could still protect the son he had raised to stand through storms, even when those storms wore the face of someone you once loved. The judge took 3 full days to deliver the final decision, and those 72 hours stretched longer than the weeks that came before them. Because once everything had been said and all the evidence laid bare, the silence that followed was no longer filled with uncertainty, but with something colder, anticipation laced with memory, with every quiet warning I had ignored, every odd glance from my father, every night I sat alone wondering how love could turn into strategy without me ever noticing the shift. And on that final morning, as I walked back into the courtroom, suit pressed and heart steady, I didn't feel the same as I had before, not broken, not desperate, but sharpened by the fire I had walked through, knowing that whatever came next, I would not face it with doubt. The judge's statement was long, filled with legal language and citations, but in the end, the message was clear. The second will stood as the valid expression of my father's wishes. Joan's challenge was denied. Her claims of undue influence were rejected, And just like that, everything she had taken, everything she had tried to turn into her victory, slipped through her fingers with the quiet rustle of a stamped court order. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't make a scene. She simply stood, gathered her things, and walked out of the room like she had somewhere better to be, like none of it mattered, and in a way, that made the entire thing even colder. But I wasn't finished. Because what the court hadn't seen, what I hadn't seen either until Robert handed me another envelope later that same afternoon, was the final piece of my father's plan. It wasn't legal, it wasn't financial, but it carried more weight than either. Inside was a handwritten letter, addressed to me in the same careful script I had seen 100 times on birthday cards and notes left beside the coffee pot. But this letter was different. This one wasn't about comfort or routine. It was a confession, a reflection, and a strategy all in one. He wrote about a meeting he had arranged just months before his death, not with a lawyer or doctor, but with a man he trusted more than either, a private contact, someone who had helped him discreetly gather information about Joan's movements, her investments, her sudden interest in assets that didn't belong to her. And what this contact uncovered was far more complex than I ever imagined. Joan hadn't just been waiting for my father to pass. She had already moved assets out of the company without my knowledge, had sold shares to shell companies registered under other names, and was quietly preparing to dismantle parts of the business the moment she was legally in control. She wasn't just after the inheritance, she was after the legacy itself. But my father had anticipated it. In secret, he had transferred the most valuable portions of his estate, several key properties, an entire logistics operation in South Carolina, and the master rights to our shipping patents, into a trust under my name, with stipulations that would only activate if Joan ever attempted to take control. These were not assets easily tracked, hidden in layered entities only he and his accountant knew how to access. And now, with the court ruling in place and Joan's challenge dismissed, all of it came back to me, untouched, intact, preserved. In that letter, he wrote that this was not about revenge, not in the bitter sense, but about protection. He couldn't stop Joan from being who she was, but he could make sure she would never walk away with more than her lies allowed. And at the end of the page, he wrote a single line I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Some people wear masks so well they forget there's a face underneath. But you, son, you never needed one. I sat in my car for over an hour after reading it, the weight of those words resting on my chest like a stone I didn't know I'd been carrying. Not because of the money, not because of the business, but because I had spent years believing I had failed to protect my father, failed to see what was happening right in front of me. And here he was, even in death, proving that he had seen it all along and had never stopped protecting me. And while Joan faded from the newspapers and the neighborhood whispers, while her name slowly vanished from the walls of the company she once tried to claim, I began to rebuild, not just the business, but myself. I didn't chase closure through anger or bitterness. I let the silence speak, let the truth do the work, and with every day that passed, I understood more clearly that my father hadn't just left me an inheritance. He left me a lesson, and that lesson was worth far more than anything Joan ever thought she could take.